Well, this is Dr. Stan back here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at, that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's got to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And, of course, it's Thursday afternoon, and this is the time when we have Joel Skousen with us for a guest, except Joel is locked out of his office, and, of course, he's going to call us as soon as he can get into the office. I don't know how long that's going to be. So if you are out there in the listening audience and you'd like to talk about something, in the meantime, we're just going to have open lines. Our telephone number is 1-888-24-LIBERTY. 1-888-24-LIBERTY or 464-8295, and we'd love to talk to you because we have nothing prepared at all. But we could probably start out talking a little bit about the new book I'm going to start writing. It's going to be called None Dare Call It Genocide. And it's very difficult for the average people to believe, for the average individual to believe. There are really people out there who want to have wars, who want to see people killed, who really want to eliminate a large part of the population of the world. But it is really true, and you can certainly go into the writings of the people. Fortunately, they have written these things down. Now, of course, I didn't want to believe this. I got started in this whole business having to do with population control when I was involved with the California Medical Association, and we were trying to actually have them introduce and use the same public health approaches to the control of AIDS that we do with all other diseases. Now, HIV was the disease is the real disease. AIDS is simply the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which comes along 5-10 years after you develop the infection. Your immune system decompensates, and you can't fight off infection, and your CD4 cell count goes down, and you eventually, of course, succumb to the disease. You get infections or cancer or tuberculosis or one of a myriad of diseases, but, of course, you can stop the spread of the disease through the community by using standard and accepted public health approaches. We did this with syphilis. What you do is you find out who has the disease, you report it to the public health officer. He actually then finds out who gave the individual the disease, who the individual gave the disease to, and go to them and try to get them to be tested and then to stop spreading the disease. That is how we could have stopped the disease long ago. Of course, we should have had premarital testing because the disease is transmitted by intimate sexual contact. We should have had prenatal testing because the disease is spread from infected mothers to their unborn children, and there are treatments that will prevent the child from getting the disease. But none of these things have been done. In fact, it was incredible. They did away with premarital testing. We used to do premarital testing for syphilis. They just stopped doing that. Why? Because they wanted an excuse not to do what was necessary to stop the spread of this deadly disease. And, of course, when I realized this was going on, I thought, well, I am going to be a man on a white horse. I am going to get the California Medical Association. I was a member of the House of Delegates at the time. I'm going to get the California Medical Association to simply approach this disease as they would any other disease and stop its spread. And, oh, how naive I was. Because, of course, after 9 years, I got the members of the House of Delegates, a lot of work on my part, sending out letters and calls, and I got the majority of the members, the doctors and the members of the House of Delegates of the California Medical Association to approve an effective public health approach, which had been laid out by the doctors in my community. People are a lot smarter than I was about public health measures. But, of course, it didn't matter that the doctors supported me and I got a standing ovation. The leaders of organized medicine had no intention of stopping the spread of this disease that's probably killed 50 or 60 million people now throughout the world, and killed probably well over 1 million Americans, or well over 500,000 Americans. We don't know exactly, but somewhere there, probably 600,000 Americans have died. Another million are infected, and they're going to die. And people all over the world are infected with this disease, and we're not trying to stop its spread. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay. And this is Thursday afternoon, and this is the time when we have Joel Skousen with us to bring us up to date on what's really going on in the world. But Joel has been locked out of his office until just now, and he just got here. So, Joel, how are you doing? And was it pretty cold and blistery back there?
It was. It's about 20 degrees out there in a blowing blizzard, and came in from the post office and couldn't get the key in the door. The lock was frozen solid. So,
well, I'm glad you're with us, and I'm going to let you bring us up to date on what the latest issue of the World Affairs Brief is going to cover.
Well, this is my annual big picture brief, Stan. At the end of every year, I do a big picture briefing on the world and where we stand in relationship to the deteriorating condition of our liberty. This is a chance to step back and take stock of all the damage that happened this past year, see past the duplicity of deception, and also update my readers on the larger global threat of war, which is still heading our way. While most of you are concerned about the economy, we must always remember that nations don't die from economic collapse, the fake collapse of the Soviet Union notwithstanding. The countries die from military conquest when their citizens become complacent and get so focused on economic hardship that they fail to see the enemy prepping for the attack, just as in the years prior to World War II. Only when Hitler became too strong to stop, this is very interesting, did our leaders raise the alarm, when they knew that the war had become inevitable. We are approaching that stage right now, I believe, and it doesn't help public awareness that no one in government nor the media is giving any hints at all that Russia or China is a problem. Oh, they give diplomatic cautious remarks about China each year, but dismiss it with a mere call for increased transparency. Fat chance, I say. With the underlying malice of deception, our government is intent on lulling us to sleep about the Russian bear and the Chinese dragon, knowing that they will someday strike, advancing the globalist agenda. And that is precisely why our leaders are building so many deep underground bunkers. They intend to survive, and so should we. Well, let's start with a tour around the hot spots of the globe. In Iraq, after more than 9 months of wrangling, a unity government is finally formed, combining most of Iraq's disparate factions, including the Muqtada al-Sadr's anti-American Shiite militia. Unity governments never work, and they're usually cobbled together after significant pressure from an outside source, in this case the U.S. Power-sharing agreements start out with one faction, like al-Maliki, running the show with promises of giving up...
Hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel, simply we got him in from the cold, apparently. It's 20 degrees back there in Utah, and the lock was frozen. He couldn't get his key into it, but he did get inside, so fortunately he's going to be with us, and he's simply talking about the fact that nobody is talking today about the fact that there's a very real danger of war with both Russia and China. Everything is done to play this down, but the elite have their underground bunkers. They have their safe havens for themselves and their families, and they're doing everything they can to certainly make the American people feel there's nothing to worry about. Now, at one time we did have an anti-ballistic missile system. We don't have one today. At one time we had civilian defense system to protect the people, and they're going to leave the American people to fend for themselves. But the elite have their bunkers. I know they have one up here in Santa Rosa, up north of where I live, and certainly they have them back in Washington, D.C. I know they have them in New Mexico and in other places, and where they all are, I certainly don't know. But I know that people who talk about this get into real trouble. There's PhD who wrote 2 books on the underground tunnels, and now he's working as a window washer someplace, last thing. He may be long since dead by now. But then, of course, Joel is talking about the situation in Iraq, and certainly in Iraq today. Why you have a government that's been pieced together by force from the United States to try to come up with a coalition government. But you see, what we should have done was broken the country into 3 parts, one for the Kurds, one for the Shias, one for the Sunnis, and we could have had peace there. But they don't want peace. They want an unstable situation so we can continue to justify keeping our troops there. But the American people really don't understand that we have no intention of pulling our troops out of that area. At least most of the troops out. We'll always have permanent troops stationed there. But go right ahead, Joel.
Well, it's not surprising, given this coalition government, especially with Muqtada al-Sadr as part of the government, that Maliki gave a rousing speech about how all U.S. soldiers must leave Iraq, no fudging of timetables, but he's lying. The Wall Street Journal had the mainstream view. They said Prime Minister Nouriel Maliki ruled out the presence of any U.S. troops in Iraq after the end of 2011, saying his new government and the country's security forces were capable of confronting any remaining threats to Iraq's security, sovereignty, and unity. A majority of Iraqis and some Iraqi and U.S. officials have assumed the U.S. presence would eventually be extended, especially after the long government limbo. But Maliki was eager to draw a line in his most definitive remarks on the subject. They said, "The last American soldier will leave Iraq, as agreed," he said, speaking at his office in Baghdad's protected green zone. "This agreement is not subject to extension, not subject to alteration. It is sealed." This is just plain nonsense. He's just posturing in public to placate the Sadrists in his unity government. The Sadrists don't even know it yet, but they've already been sold out, as al-Maliki is planning other side agreements with U.S. contractors and training assistance to allow the U.S. to continued presence. But all of this is merely a tactic to draw out the U.S. presence until the coming attack on Iran can once again excuse another round of troop surges. In Iran, as usual, in any high-profile conflict, the U.S. is playing both sides, haranguing Iran over sanctions and then allowing plenty of loopholes for favored U.S. companies who want to continue to sell products into the Iranian market. Despite sanctions, the U.S. has secretly allowed certain American companies to do billions of dollars in business. Isn't this hypocritical, Stan? All this talk about sanctions?
I think this was an article on the front pages of the New York Times within the last 10 days, and now it's come out. We are not hearing much about it on television, but the New York Times, to their credit, did report that the government has all these sanctions, and yet they've given permission for certain favored American corporations to do billions of dollars worth of trade with Iran. Well, I thought we had sanctions on Iran. I thought we were trying to bring pressure on the country so we wouldn't have to go to war with them, so they'd buckle. But you have to understand what they tell the American people and the truth are so entirely different. That's a great and very important article.
Yeah, two of the big companies, Kraft Foods and Coca-Cola, or Pepsi-Cola, and also, naturally, every one of our too big to fail banks have offices that are still operating and dealing with Iranian money. Now, there's a little-known office of the U.S. Treasury Department that has granted nearly 10,000 licenses for deals involving countries that have been cast into economic purgatory beyond the reach of American business. I'm sure this doesn't surprise any of your listeners. Our government rarely tells us the whole truth.
And I think that, of course, these businesses that get special favors tie into the Brotherhood of Darkness. Certainly Pepsi and Coke and ties right in there, and so does Kraft. So basically, there is this two-tiered system we have. We have the Brotherhood of Darkness organizations, corporations, banks. They get special privileges not available to others.
Well, meanwhile, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in Bahrain, reassuring the King of Bahrain that U.S. is ready and willing to attack Iran, giving the proper provocation. JournalNow.com quoted him as saying, "We're very ready," an unusually direct acknowledgement that the U.S. has contingency plans to counter Iran should it make a move. My comment is President Ahmadinejad is just unstable enough to fall into some trap. Any military move, however small, could be used by the U.S. or Israel to justify an attack. There are real threats, said Mullen, to peace and stability here, and we've made no secret of our concerns about Iran. I'm also predicting, of course, that Israel will start this war, which has been in the planning phases since 2002. They've just had a terrible, difficult time provoking Iran into justifying an attack. The U.S. and Israel are still waiting for the right provocation so that it doesn't look like an act of blatant aggression that it really is. Well, in Israel, for at least now, has been able to successfully diffuse the settlement expansion issue and derail Obama's quick push for a token peace plan agreement with the Palestinian Authority. But they aren't out of the woods yet. The Israeli military has gone into full war preparation. This is a very important thing I'm announcing here. It's now in a race to see which comes first. The long-anticipated Israeli air assault on Iran's nuclear plants, which, of course, will provoke a major regional war with Hezbollah, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, or the long-anticipated rocket barrage from Lebanon and Syria, which in turn will provoke that same regional war and justify an immediate Israeli attack on Iran. You see what I'm saying? In either case, whether Israel moves first or whether or not the Arabs moves first, it's going to result in the same, a major regional war involving the U.S. and Israel against the Arab states. Israel, in the latter case, would only do the initial strike and then call upon the U.S. to take over as it returned to confront the missile war with its neighboring states. The surrounding Arab states have thousands of mostly non-precision missiles pointed at Israel, and the IDF knows that Israel will suffer significant damage under any number of scenarios. One Israeli general even admitted that Israel's vaunted Iron Dome missile defense shield of interceptors had only enough capacity to defend the military. Too bad for you civilians. Well, that's not how it was sold to the public. And remember, as you pointed out, the United States has this token missile defense system, some 8 or 6 missile interceptors up there in Alaska and some half a dozen over there in Europe. And this is supposed to protect against thousands of Russian and Chinese and North Korean missiles. They're going to tell the public the same thing. Oh, no, we were just anticipating some rogue missile strike. We never intended to defend against a Russian massive first strike. Well, as far as China, there's an article that came out in the UK Telegraph that pretty well sums up everything. It says, China preparing for armed conflict in every direction. I don't know if you saw that today, Stan, but it was quite a dramatic...
No, I haven't. Tell me about it, but I certainly believe it, and I think that we need to get the American people alarmed and begin making preparations, because only those who make preparations are going to survive. I'm firmly convinced.
Well, it said, China's preparing for conflict in every direction, the defense minister said on Wednesday, in remarks that threatened to overshadow, this is a real understatement, overshadow a visit to Beijing by his U.S. counterpart next month. In the coming 5 years, he said, our military will push forward preparations for military conflict in every strategic direction. This was an interview published in several state-backed newspapers in China. That means they want this word out. They want to rattle some sabers. This comes on the heels of, last month or so, the Chinese ballistic missile blown off into our airspace off of the coast of Los Angeles. I mean, it's a blatant, in-your-face thing, look, we can sneak right up during one of your naval exercises and shoot off a missile. And yet the U.S. is in denial about that, even though there was considerable consternation at the Pentagon, according to sources, which I quoted in the brief. China repeatedly says it is planning a peaceful rise. That's the old Sun Tzu doctrine of feigning peace while preparing for war. But the recent pace and scale of its military modernization has alarmed many of its neighbors in Asia-Pacific, including Japan, which described China's military buildup as a global concern and has started defensive measures of its own. China also announced this month that it's preparing to launch its own aircraft carrier next year in a signal that China is determined to punch its weight as a rising superpower. I think the real reason is that it's got to control, and that's the deal with Russia. When Russia makes this strike on the West, China will control the eastern back door to Russia, all the way from Japan down to Australia and New Zealand. That's why in my book, Strategic Relocation, I don't recommend New Zealand and Australia. I think they're going to get occupied by China during the next war, and they will be even more ruthless than the Japanese occupiers were in Indochina. China's also working on a carrier-killing ballistic missile that could sink U.S. carriers from afar, fundamentally reordering the balance of power in the region that has been dominated, by U.S. naval power for so many decades.
And I think these are all things we should be thinking about, but we're not thinking about it because the media is controlled and basically they're setting America up for war. We have unilaterally disarmed. We have taken down a very effective anti-ballistic missile system we had in the 1970s, but it spent, I don't know how many tens of billions of dollars building it, but we dismantled it because it was going to cost $1 billion a year to maintain it. We dismantled it under Jimmy Carter, and then George W. Bush, because he's such a great American hero, he built 6 anti-ballistic missiles to take out thousands of incoming Russian missiles, and I didn't ever understand how that was going to work. Go right ahead.
Well, as China modernizes, Mr. Liang pledged that his armed forces would also increasingly use homegrown Chinese technology, of course, borrowing heavily from stolen U.S. technology, which analysts say still lags behind Western technology, even as China races to catch up. Well, they are catching up just as Russia continues to catch up with stolen U.S. technology. A lot of it isn't stolen. A lot of it is given to them. The United States uses Israel as a channel for higher technology that they don't want to get caught giving to China directly. They use Israel. They transfer it to Israel. Israel puts it into an indigenous piece of weaponry and then sells it to China. And this is known to the United States, but there's no sanctions on Israel. The modernization of the Chinese military cannot depend on others, said Liang, and cannot be bought. In the next 5 years, this gives us more time to prepare, Stan. He says our economy and society will develop faster, boosting comprehensive national power. We will take the opportunity and speed up modernization of our military. I think they mean what they say, and I think the United States is simply lulling people into a false sense of security by not making this a major issue.
Agreed. Go right ahead.
Well, going on to Russia now, an interesting quote has surfaced from a Russian journalist confirming what I have long said about how Clinton's ruthless attack on Serbia embittered the Russians against the U.S. in the free markets. Alexander Zhuslin wrote, he's a Russian journalist, generals have told me that we must build a monument to Clinton because of the campaign over Kosovo, drastically changed political attitudes here. Now there is no more opposition to the idea that Russia should restore its military potential against the United States. Isn't that exactly what I said? Years ago when this assault on the Balkans was taking place in such a ruthless manner and turned the Slavic peoples against the United States. Well, the Russians are doing just that. I recently covered the Russian deployment of the newest version of the Topol M ballistic missile, the RS-24. After 2012, Russia will deploy only the newer version. The RS-24 ICBM is designed to carry 4 nuclear warheads. Meanwhile, the U.S. keeps disarming, which is always a prelude to another world war. I want to reemphasize that. Every time we have gone to war, whether it's World War I, World War II, or now World War III, there has been a significant period of disarming that is a prelude to that war. And we're in that process right now.
Agreed, and of course we're doing everything we can to help the Chinese communists build up their military exactly as we did with Germany before the Second World War. 100 American corporations over there building up the war weapons for Adolf Hitler both before and during the war, and they were never punished. The American people never know. And it's the American corporations that are over there building up the military potential for the Chinese communists, and you say, why in heaven's name would we do that? Well, you can't have a war unless you have an enemy, can you?
That's right. Well, nobody talks about Russia's main factory bunker complex anymore. So busy is the government trying to assure the U.S. about Russia's peaceful intentions. Still the most recently dated article about Yamato Mountain is clear back in 1997. Dan, isn't that amazing? Not a single article about that since then. This was written by Bruce Balfour, worked for Federation of American Scientists, kind of a leftist anti-nuclear group. But still, it's the only thing we've got. Pretty accurate. Talks about both Yamato and Kozinsky mountain complexes. They're within several miles of each other.
All right, basically Joel is talking about the complexes they have in Russia, these entire mountains where they're underground cities there, and of course these are going to be used for launching the war against us and then for the survival of large numbers of their population. They're making preparations in Russia to actually preserve their population. They have all sorts of fallout shelters in all their major cities. Here in America we have absolutely nothing. We've disbanded it all, and you have to ask yourself why. We would have tremendous numbers of casualties, far more than they would have in Russia, but go right ahead.
Well, according to a dated CIA report, construction work is continuing. Actually, it's now completed on a nuclear survivable strategic command post at Kozinsky Mountain, located deep in the Ural Mountains, about 850 miles east of Moscow. Satellite photographs of Yamanto Mountain, also located 850 miles east of Moscow, near the town of Beloretsk, show continued digging at the deep underground complex and new construction at each of the site's above-ground support areas. Yamanto Mountain means evil mountain in the local Bashkir language. Well, the command post Kazinsky Mountain appears to provide the Russians with the means to retaliate against a nuclear attack. The rationale for the Yamanto complex is unclear, says the CIA. Well, the CIA always dismisses it as defensive, which they cannot possibly know because they've never been inside it. According to a CIA report, the Russians are building or renovating 4 complexes within Moscow that would be used to house senior Russian government leaders during a nuclear strike. Remember, this is after the supposed fall of the Soviet Union that they're building all these bunkers. It shows how this is just a false proposition. A map published in the report showed new subway construction underway from Victory Park Station in Moscow to Mr. Yeltsin's dacha, which is now Putin's dacha, some 13 miles west of the Kremlin, about 4 miles from the Moscow Ring Road. Additionally, the CIA report stated that a bunker for Russian leaders at Baranova, about 46 miles south of Moscow, is nearly complete. Now, that's in 1997, so that means it's already complete. A second bunker located at Sharapova, some 35 miles from Moscow, has a special underground subway running directly to it. The subway system for the Russian leaders allows for rapid evacuation of leaders during wartime from Moscow. Presuming the leadership would then be flown to the Yamanto or Kazinsky complexes. Well, in 1997, a congressional record insertion disagreed with the CIA's contention that this was defensive. It said, reports indicate that Russia has been pursuing construction of a massive underground facility of unknown purposes at Yamanto Mountain in the city of Meshgorev, formerly the settlements of Beloretsk and Beloretsk 16, that is designed to survive nuclear war and appears to exceed reasonable defense requirements. Well, that was probably about as general as they could put it, as non-offensive as they could say that the CIA was lying. I remember that front-page article in the New York Times that showed a satellite photo of Yamanto Mountain with all these 5 railroad lines going in and out of it and asking the CIA what do they think of this, and they thought, oh, it's just defensive. Well, how did they know that? They've never been inside. Congressional record report said the Yamanto Mountain project does not appear to be consistent with the lowering of strategic threats, openness, or cooperation that is the basis of post-war disarmament agreements. Well, that's a real understatement. Russia appears to be engaging in a campaign to deliberately conceal and mislead the U.S. about the purpose of the Yamanto Mountain, as shown by the following. General Bashkortostan, People's Deputy let's see how you pronounce this, Leonid Akimovich Chirkanov, Commandant of Belarus 15 and 16, stated in 1991 and 92 that the purpose of the construction was to build a mining and ore processing complex. Later, he claimed it was an underground warehouse for food and clothing. Then, one of the ministers, Shakirova, a former communist official in the region, alleged in 1992 that Yamanto Mountain facility was to become a shelter for Russian leadership in case of nuclear war. Sources then in the Segodnya newspaper in 1996 claims that it was in fact associated with Operation Deadhead to be able to do nuclear retaliatory command and control. And that is closer to the truth.
And you remember, of course, when Dick Cheney was the vice president, why all the neighbors were complaining about the explosions down there under his house where they were putting in a big bunker for Dick Cheney, because he didn't want, of course, to have, it was only for, apparently, he and his family, but they blasted out a big chamber down under Dick Cheney's house when he was the vice president right there in Washington, D.C. All the neighbors were complaining. Just one little article I remember reading in the New York Times, and everybody else is silent about it. But the elite looks after themselves, and you better start doing the same. Bye-bye. We'll be right back in a moment.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea,
Well, Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, Stan, it's let's see where we are. We're just talking about this great big underground complex, and it really is in size about the area that spans the entire Washington, D.C. Beltway area, some 400 square miles. I mean, this is just an incredible This is not a command bunker. This is an underground factory complex in which they have missile factories and other things which the U.S. will never be able to inspect. I believe that they're stockpiling excess missile and warhead production down there. There was a very telling remark that came from then commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, General Eugene Hobbiger, who called Yamato a very large complex. We estimate that it has millions of square feet available for underground facilities. And we don't have a clue as to what they're doing there. No clue? I mean, surely he can imagine something. This is the same clueless commander who did a PBS special about his camaraderie with his Russian peers in the missile service. The film showed Hobbiger waxing eloquent about Russian transparency as the film crew was guided through some old World War II missile bunker complex, obviously very obsolete. Former Representative Roscoe Bartlett, Republican of Maryland, was the only congressman at the time sufficiently worried to issue this warning. Quote, the Yamato complex is located close to one of Russia's remaining nuclear weapons labs, Chelyabinsk 70, giving rise to speculation it could house either a nuclear warhead storage site, a missile base, a secret nuclear weapons production center, a directed energy laboratory, or a buried command post, or all of the above. Whatever it is, he says, Yamato was designed to survive a nuclear war, and that's absolutely right. The Russians don't believe in mutually assured destruction. They believe in U.S. assured destruction and their own survival.
And leaders are doing everything to assure that the Russians are correct. I mean, the most logical thing would be to try to preserve the lives of as many Americans as you can, and yet they're leaving our population vulnerable while the Russians are trying to protect their population. And you have to ask yourself, why in heaven's name would that be taking place today? We'll be right back in a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is just talking about Yamato Mountain. It's obviously that this is an area that they're going to be able to have extra missiles. We've never been able to inspect this area. We let the Russians see everything we have, but they will not let us see their important areas. They have enough area there to store probably millions of people could be safe there in case of a nuclear war. They are planning on war. They're working full-time for war. And our leaders are saying there's just nothing to worry about. The Russians are just nice people, and we're doing everything we can to help them. And if you haven't seen our little pamphlet on the Communist-Capitalist Alliance, and going into the background of who it was who provided the money and the wherewithal to drill those oil wells that made Russia the largest oil producer in the world, and who it was who provided the money and the technology to build the Russian gas wells, which made Russia the largest producer of natural gas in the world, why you need to get that little pamphlet, the Communist-Capitalist Alliance. Joel, before we go on, I want you to go ahead and get out your information on how people could get a copy of the World Affairs Brief and subscribe to it.
Thanks, Dr. Stan. The World Affairs Brief is showcased on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. It's been clobbered today because of my interview on Coast to Coast last night. In fact, I'm still yawning from the experience. It goes from about midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning.
Well, but it's wonderful that you get on there and that you get the information out. And I just hope that, lots of people are listening, because he has, certainly George Norrie has a tremendous listening audience.
Well, we, in any case, just as I told the audience last night, people can get a free sample copy of the World Affairs Brief if they'd like to consider subscribing. They can email me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. And the website also showcases all of the books that I've written on preparedness. I think it's very important as we try to fight for our liberty that we prepare for a takedown in case we are not able to win, in case the judgments of the Lord come upon this nation, which I think are very likely. I have 3 major books: The Secure Home, 700 pages of everything from A to Z about how to establish a residential secure home or a retreat, remodeling included. Also everything about total self-sufficiency from generators to solar to water power, and a huge section with sources in the back. Strategic relocation is still not back in print. It's in typesetting and covers being printed as we speak. Should be ready to ship by the end of January. We're sorry that this has taken so long, but it's been awfully difficult to redo this entire book in such a large manner and still run my world affairs brief and have a life. I know you know how that is, Dr. Stan.
I certainly do, but I appreciate what you do. Incidentally, these books, there are three of them. We don't have the certainly strategic relocation, but we have the other two, and they're available by calling 1-800-544-8927, and as soon as the strategic relocation is available, why, we'll be carrying that as well. But you can get the other two by calling 1-800-544-8927, and it'll take you certainly a couple of weeks before you can read all those through, and then we'll have the third one ready.
Yeah, the second book is the How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. It's a complete architectural plan book, including concealed entrances to a secure room that you build within your own basement, all with do-it-yourself techniques. So it can be done for about $3,000, which is pretty economical for a full safe room.
Right.
Well, going back to the story here, in other news, the Russian High Command is relishing the naivete of the French in accepting Russia's proposal to help NATO guard its eastern border with Russia. Now, isn't that something? That NATO, instead of having to put ballistic missile systems, Russia's offering to put their own anti-missile systems in the border states. How convenient. I'll bet those ABMs never get launched against an incoming Russian missile strike. Fools or traitors are born every minute in Europe. Well, while things are going in favor of the Russian rearmament and against Europe, which is getting more and more dependent upon Russia for natural gas and strategic minerals, my projected timetable for war remains unchanged. It is not imminent and probably will take till the end of the decade to fully materialize. I wouldn't bet on that in terms of your preparations, though. I think people ought to be prepared by the middle of this decade at the latest. The two key trigger events to watch for will be either Russian troops moving into occupied portions of the Baltic states or Eastern Europe, or in support of the, quote, beleaguered Russians living there. This is the same excuse that Hitler used to attack Poland and Czechoslovakia. Or an attack on South Korea by the North Koreans, which would probably require a nuclear response, tactical nukes, by the U.S. to stop such an attack. That would hand Russia and China the excuse to launch nuclear missiles at the U.S. to take down the bully of the world. Well, moving on now to Europe, 2011 will see a widening debt crisis in Europe, and the Fed will once again offer more paper dollars to bail out the banks there. Ireland is still not out of the water since its residents won't tolerate the necessary austerity measures to allow the Irish government to stop deficit spending. Spain and Portugal will either see their debt ratings go to the bottom this year too. One of the disadvantages that the European nations individually have compared to the U.S. is that they cannot exceed a 3% limit on monetary inflation. I actually think that's good. But they just can't print their way out of these problems like the U.S. can and does. Any threat of default in the EU will be met with new calls for more sovereign EU powers to deal with the crisis, always strengthening the New World Order in Europe and never allowing it to go back to national sovereignty. We also need to be watchful for a potential collapse of the British pound and their debt this year as well. There's been several warnings, including Lord Blackheath's statement talking about this foundation offering to pay off and to buy up the British debt. Protesters are demonstrating and striking all over Europe, telling governments they won't accept austerity measures and cuts in tuition and welfare benefits. That's the socialist mentality for you, a death knell for Europe eventually. Well, moving on to the U.S. won't come out of unscathed either in 2011. We'll see the probable start of a wave of municipal bond defaults and the need for a massive federal bailout of at least half a dozen states. Perennially bearish monetary advisor Martin Weiss has the facts. He said, I predict the rich states like California and New York, plus thousands of cities of all sizes will suffer a similar crisis as we had in the Brazil crisis a decade ago. Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, these are the major bond rating agencies, are paid huge fees by thousands of state and local governments for giving them ratings that are typically overinflated. This is like the typical thing that happened during the real estate boom, when you'd go to an appraiser and you'd ask, well, how much do you need this house appraised for? And he'd give you what you wanted. Well, they're paid additional fees for rating the insurance companies that supposedly guarantee the municipal bond payments for investors. And then they rake in all those fees year after year simply by maintaining ratings that are often based on simply grossly outdated data.
But didn't a lot of these certainly communities also have, the people would buy insurance from these various corporations have gone bankrupt, but they got insurance, so there was just no way they could lose on their bonds because the bonds were insured. The only trouble is that the companies that insured the bonds went bankrupt.
That's right, and they're not just going to get to that. The municipal bond ratings is a farce. It's based on payola and riddled with conflicts of interest. It's collapsing for three reasons. One, the entire concept of municipal bond insurance, riddled with the same conflicts, has crumbled. Two, the largest bond insurers, AMBAC and FGIC, are already bankrupt. They've collapsed already, with FGIC now subject to possible liquidation by New York State regulators. MBIA Incorporated, the only surviving bond insurer among the big three, has just been downgraded by 3 notches to B-. That's deep into junk territory. That means they don't have the money to pay off their insurance contracts.
And so the people who are holding these bonds, either going to have to dump them at a tremendous loss or take the chance of being there, and they go into default and they'll get nothing.
Yeah. That's what we're looking at, and I think it's just going to be a matter of everyone calling for a bailout. Hundreds of thousands of investors who bought insured bonds are now vulnerable. They thought that they were buying protection against default. Instead, they got a little more than a pig in a poke. Second, it's collapsing because many cities are years behind in providing accurate financial data. While their finances have deteriorated in a matter of months, consequently, a large portion of the data is not only grossly outdated, it's downright wrong, failing to properly reflect the recent sharp deterioration in local finances. And third, the municipal bond ratings farce is collapsing because of the disastrous situation on the ground. Consider these excerpts from 60 Minutes. In the 2 years since the Great Recession wrecked their economies and shriveled their income, the states have collectively spent nearly $500 billion more than they have collected in taxes. And a good portion of that is California, New York, and Illinois. There are at least a third of the states that are in the black, or that will be in the black after they finish the latest rounds of cuts. There's also a $1 trillion hole in their public pension funds. The states have been getting by on billions of dollars in federal stimulus funds, but the day of reckoning is still at hand. The debt crisis is already making Wall Street nervous, and some believe that it could derail the recovery, cost 1 million public employee jobs at the state and local level, and require another big bailout package that no one in Washington is willing to admit to at this point. I'd made the point, Stan, that all of this is going to fall due on what? The Republican Congress. And all of their intentions about this pledge to America about no more deficit spending are just going to go right out the window. California, which faces a $19 billion budget deficit next year, has a credit rating approaching junk bond status. It now spends more money on public employee pensions than it does on the state university system, which had to increase its tuition by 32%. Arizona's so desperate, get this, Stan, it sold off its state capitol, the Supreme Court building and legislative chambers, to a group of investors, and now leases it back from the new owner. Actually, that's a pretty plush lease because the government will guarantee to keep paying the lease. That's one of the 3 types of leases that I recommend for commercial buildings. Of course, you have to have several $100 million to buy these buildings. The state also eliminated in Arizona Medicaid funding for most organ transplants. And then there's New Jersey. It has the highest taxes in the country, a $10 billion deficit, and a depressed economy when first-year Governor Christie took office. But after looking at the books, he decided to walk away from a long-planned and much-needed project with the New York and the federal government to build a rail tunnel into Manhattan. The bottom line, said Christie, is that I don't have the money. And you know what? I can't pay people for those jobs if I don't have the money to pay them. Where am I going to get the money? I don't have it. I literally don't have it. The day of reckoning has arrived for New Jersey, he said. That's it. And it's going to arrive everywhere. Timing will vary a bit depending on which state you're in, buddy. It's coming. He's a pretty direct speaker. I wish I had more confidence in his principles, though. But if you think California and New Jersey in bad shape, wait till you see Illinois. 60 Minutes also interviewed Illinois State Paymaster Hines. Listen to this, Dan. A man who currently has about $5 billion in outstanding bills in his office and not enough money in the state's coffers to pay them. Care to know how far he's behind in paying his bills? 6 months. 6 months behind.
Yeah, but what he's going to do, they're going to get Wall Street to come in and pay off all those debts, and then they're going to pay Wall Street off, but they're going to have to pay him 12.5% interest on the money that they put out to get the debts paid. Where are they going to get the 12.5% when they don't have the money to even pay their debts today? And nobody ever asked those questions.
That's right. Well, there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people waiting to be paid by the state of Illinois. Pretty much anybody who has any interaction with state government, we owe money to, Hines said. That includes the University of Illinois, which is owed $400 million, small businessmen such as Mura Shaw, who owns a pharmacy in Chicago and has been waiting months to receive $200,000 in back Medicare payments, and 2,000 not-for-profit organizations who are owed $1 billion by the state. Now, I don't have much sympathy for those not-for-profit organizations who got in bed with the state. They exist simply on state money. So the big problem is the more the cities and states slash their budgets, the more it sinks their local economies and their tax base, the more additional cuts they have to make. Governor Christie of New Jersey, for example, cut his budget by 26%. He cut billions to schools. He laid off thousands of teachers, and he cut another 1,300 state workers. He drastically reduced funding to cities, counties, and villages, all in trouble themselves. And yet, despite all those cuts, New Jersey's still facing another $10 billion of red ink in 2011 because the tax base is just shrinking accordingly. And that's just the immediate problem. Long term, New Jersey alone has a $46 billion deficit in unfunded liabilities to pensions and $66 billion. Now, this is the state, not the federal government. $66 billion in unfunded liabilities for health care. Sound familiar? It should, because it's happening in states all across the country, and it parallels two looming disasters in the federal level, Social Security and Medicare. Now, as I mentioned recently, this future economic disaster will fall upon the Republican Congress, and all their pledge to rein in spending will go out the window. There's no shortage of crises on the horizon to justify continued stimulus spending. I still don't believe it will reach the level of higher inflation next year. Real inflation is running about 5 to 7%. However, if the predicted food shortages develop, prices could rise rapidly. And also, if the U.S. and Israel attack Iran, expect to see gasoline rise to above $5 a gallon, and that will really hurt the recovery as well.
I think that is really what's going to happen. I think oil is going to $150, maybe $200 a barrel, and when that happens, why our economy is going to tank.
Well,
go ahead.
Crises, of course, are food for tyranny. As John Griffling wrote this week, what does any would-be tyrant need in order to gain control of the lives of its citizens? 3 things come to mind, he said: martial law, socialized medicine, and food dependency. Well, I might say I personally don't think that martial law will be declared anytime soon until war, but the police state is already here and probing our resistance. It's instructive to watch the 3 main pillars of a police state as they have developed in the last few years. 1, an ample supply of unprincipled police officers, former military that are willing to treat citizens roughly in violation of their rights. Many of these policemen come from mercenary and military backgrounds. Number 2, a ready and ever-present excuse to play roughshod on people, and the phony terror threat justifies this kind of abuse. And number 3, a corrupt court system that refuses to stand up for citizens' rights and sanction the police.
Well, we've got about a few more minutes, so I agree with everything you're saying. Go right ahead.
Well, not a single complaint has been ruled in favor of the victims of TSA abuse, and less than 2% of police abuse cases. The most disturbing thing about the recent spate of TSA groping of victims is that when they make any verbal protest in the least, or worse, mention anything about their constitutional rights, they're taken out of the sight of the public into a separate room and subjected to harassment, foul language, and rough handling, including being thrown on the floor and handcuffed. No witnesses are allowed, and the TSA are now primed to make sure that no one is secretly recording their actions.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, in virtually 100% of the cases of TSA abuse and harsh treatment, 100%, Stan, the agents have filed false reports claiming that the victims attack them or goaded them into the strong action, so that when the victim takes them to court, they can come in and say, oh, the victim caused it. With no other witnesses allowed, it's always their word against yours. The courts have always sided with the TSA. It's a 100% track record, and this is just unconscionable. What I'm warning about, it means we already have a police state in vogue in the United States. Just because they aren't declaring martial law doesn't mean that this police state doesn't exist. The conduct of local police assisting TSA is also servile and appalling. It is clear that they have been given orders by their chief to do anything the TSA tells them, which is particularly galling. No longer are they acting as arbiters between the aggrieved citizen, passenger, and the TSA. They always take the side of government. It's also very disturbing to note that all forms of law enforcement are told to confiscate any recording device or cell phone that documents potential abuse. This is just a very, very bad precedent. It's the hallmark of a police state, and it's already here. That's my warning.
Well, I think that they're not stupid. They have to know that they're just antagonizing the American people. It's almost as if they're goading them into some sort of reaction.
Well, it does violate the general rule that you don't irritate the American people most of the time on a regular basis, but I think they're doing it because they want people to get used to this kind of treatment. They're not going to back down. That's what's so aggravating about this. No matter how egregious it gets, TSA refuses to back down. Congress won't do anything, and the courts will not act on our behalf. And that's what I stated in my speech about why the Constitution is essentially dead, is that it's just lip service to it now.
Well, it's going to be very interesting what happens when the Republicans get in there. No, I'm not saying they're going to solve all the problems, but let's just see if they have the courage to say to the TSA, stop. And maybe they won't. Probably they won't. But let's hope there may be a few people there in Congress who do feel a sense of responsibility to the public. We're just about out of time. You got about 30 seconds to wrap up today's program.
Well, I think this is a very important concept that I'm trying to say, though, is that just because it's not happening to you, if they have the power and if the courts have already made a precedent that they're not going to defend us, we have a police state. There is no habeas corpus. There isn't anything against indefinite detention. I think we're up a creek.
Well, we're in real trouble, and I believe God's judgment is coming on America. All we can do is wait and hope that we can raise enough awareness in the meantime and bring enough people into a personal relationship with our Lord that we can change the course of things. I don't know whether we can. Our job is not to succeed. Our job is to try. Well, I guess there's been Joel Skousen. Joel, we're going to miss you for the next 3 weeks, but we'll look forward to having you back. What was the 24th of January?
Right. Thank you very much, Dan.
And have a wonderful time wherever you're going, and God bless, and we'll talk to you next year.
All right, bye.
God bless. Bye-bye. Okay, fellas, I hope you enjoy our conversations with Joel Skousen. Pretty much one-sided conversation, but Joel has fascinating information. I always look forward to his analysis, and you should as well, because he's certainly one of the few people who has the background in intelligence and certainly the contacts to evaluate what's going on. We are in real trouble in America, ladies and gentlemen, because this country's turned its back on God, and there's been an organized effort by the people who run our country, what I call the invisible government, or the Brotherhood of Darkness. We have a visible government, we have an invisible government, and it's made of very wealthy and powerful people who have a different agenda, whose loyalty is not to the United States, but to this globalist dream, and behind that, the powerful spiritual forces which energize this drive towards the one world government. You need to read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need, of course, to read my pamphlets on the occult hierarchy. You need to see the 3 DVDs. The Secret Mystery of America's Beginning, because it's a good place to begin and understanding, learning the history of America and the fact that when this country was founded, even before the Declaration of Independence, there were 2 major forces here. One, the Christian, and the other, the occult. And the plan of the occult was always to remain hidden, but eventually to take over control of government and then use our financial and military power to take over the world, to create an empire. And this is what we've done. If you haven't certainly read the Confessions of an Economic Reformer by Economic Hitman, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, or heard our 4-tape set with him, you need to get that. We also have his John Perkins book, The Secret American Empire. You need to understand what is really going on. And then, of course, as far as the coming war with China and Russia, you need to understand how we build up the German military, both before and during the war, and the 150 Americans who were over there building the weapons for Hitler during the war were never punished, and you've never heard about it. That's covered in a book called America's Nazi Secret. We have 3 books, and you need to get them. Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Professor Sutton, and then, of course, we have my interview with him on DVD, The Best Enemies Money Could Buy, How We Financed the North Vietnamese, indirectly all during the Vietnam War while they were killing our boys. I mean, after all, how could a little country the size of the state of Mississippi hold off the mightiest nation in the world for all those years? Well, it was because we didn't try to win. We never were in a real war. It was a make-believe war, and 58,000 American boys perished. They were sent to suffer and bleed and fight courageously and die so that we could transform America. And if you don't understand the background of that, you need to read the McGeorge Bundy's article, January 1967 in Foreign Affairs magazine, or certainly get my a 4-tape set on Vietnam, The Untold Story. Vietnam, The Untold Story. But we have the 3 books on how we actually built up Adolf Hitler's Germany, produced the weapons for him, 100 American corporations. We have the letter I found from Ambassador Dodd to Colonel House, written in 1936. He's the American ambassador to Germany. He's saying, why are all these American corporations building up the German war machine? Nobody here wants another war. We just got through with a terrible war. Why are these American corporations doing that when they can't even make a profit? Poor old Ambassador Dodd didn't understand. We were creating the best enemy money could buy. The books you need would be, and you incidentally you can get a copy of that letter. It's in our Iraq the Untold Story syllabus, or we'll get you a copy of the letter if you get anything else from us and request it. You need the book Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. You need America's Nazi Secret, and now we have Charles Hyam's book, Trading with the Enemy. The Rockefellers were having their oil tankers supply the diesel for the Nazi submarines that were sinking American ships, but we can't let the American people know that. And yet, of course, this foreshadows what's going on today. Those books are available by calling 1-800-544-8927. My interview with Professor Sutton, The Best Enemies Money Could Buy. That's on DVD. And then please pray for America, pray for revival, pray for the other Christian ministries throughout the world who are being persecuted, but please pray for Radio Liberty. Well, you have a wonderful new year, and we will see you when you get back. Thank you for getting me Andrew's telephone number. We will call it.
There you go.
Andrew, and see if he'll fill in next week.
Schedule for 3 weeks, it turns out. So. Yeah.
I'm going to miss Joel.
I know. Yeah, there's